we have Amy Gaviglio on speaking to extended family, tough topics in ALD.
All right, so this will definitely be a bit of a shift in topics from the very scientific presentations that we've been hearing, but I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about communication around this disease because it is, as we've heard, I think in many of the family stories, so very important. So truly this topic could be a day-long session in and of itself. There are a shocking number of frameworks and theories around communication, around risk, around communication, around health information, but I only have 20 to 30 minutes, so this is how I've structured the talk. I'll start really with my goals for today, and then we'll talk generally about communicating genetic risk information to family members, including some of the various considerations for actually preparing families or preparing yourself as a family to have this conversation. And then we'll go into some more detail on what you might actually want to communicate, how to address some of the possible reactions you may hear from family members, and then we'll end hopefully with just kind of a summary of steps. So I have three main goals for my time today. The first is, of course, to provide some background on the different communication frameworks and learning styles that really help us to start thinking about the ways and actual processes to have this conversation. But ultimately, my goal is to empower providers to have this conversation and to really support families in having this conversation and empower families to actually speak with their family members, as well as preparing, again, providers and families for thinking of ways to address the possible reactions that you can get from family members. So we'll dive into communicating genetic risk information. And so, sorry that it looks like it got a little funny, but in general, when we work with families about disclosing and communicating genetic risk, we start to focus on 6 kind of primary components. And this is really before we even get into the idea of the content and the disease-specific information. So the first is really, what is the family, the index or the proband family's feelings or reactions toward this potential communication? How do they feel about telling other family members about their child's results or their results and their possible risk to family members? The next is really that perceived relevance to family members about their child's results, their results, and the anticipated reactions of family members. This can get a little bit into making sure that families understand the disease and the inheritance and have an appreciation of who else might be at risk in the family. So you can ask questions of the family in terms of who they see this information being relevant to, how do they think family members would react if they told them, and really starting to kind of forward think into what this conversation would look like. Next, we want to really address and assess the closeness of relationships with family. And by closeness, I mean, I know it's so sad, little one. Closeness of emotional closeness to your family members, as well as geographic closeness to your family members. This can really dictate the modality in which you might do communication with your family. From there, it's important for us also to really talk about family values and really get an idea of what the family looks like as a unit. How open are the families in terms of talking about health information or private information? In many families, this is something that is never discussed, and knowing where that is and kind of baselining that can really help us structure the best path for families. Are there certain rules of authority in the family? Are there area or individuals who are really seen as the authoritarian? Is it best to start with them and then trickle down to family members? And again, this idea of receptivity, how often is health information communicated within the family? After we've assessed those kind of more psychosocial aspects of communication, we can start to think a little bit more into logistics. And so this can be really, what is the right time to provide this information? And understanding the vulnerability of the family at the time, as well as the potential vulnerability of family members, and making sure that we're thinking about how we might go about this. And then finally, we want to make sure that no family feels like they have to have this communication on their own. What are the role of others? And that can be us as healthcare providers, genetic counselors, and providing support, but it can also be others in the family or friends who can be there and also help you in providing this information. So I hope from the last slide, illustrating all of the concepts that we need to consider, it is clear that communicating genetic risk is not just as easy as picking up the phone. It is exceedingly complicated and nuanced, and very few of us are comfortable, let alone trained, to provide this type of news. And so I think it's important for us to think about why this is not always easy, and to approach families, and families reflect themselves on aspects that will impact if, when, and how a family will choose to communicate. So things that we want to think about are feelings of responsibility. And this can be a responsibility to share information, or it can be a responsibility to protect your families from information, feelings of guilt and blame. We've already talked a bit about the perceived relevance of information. Who is this information most relevant to at the time of disclosure? We've talked a little bit about family dynamics, but I also want to talk about the family's own psychological burden. I think we've heard the word trauma numerous times throughout this conference, and we need to appreciate that we're asking families who are going through a traumatic experience to now disclose that experience and almost invite people into that traumatic experience with them, and that's very, very difficult. And so we need to provide support and thinking through how we can best do this. Anticipated recipient reactions. If you think your family members are going to be not happy to hear this information, you're not going to be motivated to provide this information. We have to think about how we can kind of move past and deal with anticipated reactions. And then, of course, the comfort with the disease or genetic information. It's one thing for us to know this information. It's one thing for family members to know this information and have the motivation to know this information. It's another thing to be able to communicate that clearly, concisely, and compassionately to other family members. And I really highlight all of this kind of background for two reasons. So for those of us in the room that serve as providers, I want to remind us that family disclosure and communication is so much more than just giving a family letter, just giving content, giving information. And for the families in the room, I want to acknowledge, one, that this can be a very, very difficult thing, and it is both okay and exceedingly understandable if you are really struggling with this part of the process. So how might we think about actually approaching family communication? So if anyone knows me, they know that I almost start every one of my slide decks with a why. I think it's really important for us to think about why do we want to communicate this information? Really asking families to consider what their why is. And here's a list of things that I think we're all well aware of. Obviously, information can help members make different medical decisions. We may want to encourage them to get genetic testing. We may want them to consider participation in clinical trials, and there may be many others. But if we can start with our why, that will really frame the rest of our how, what, and when. So in some cases, families have found it actually really useful to plan this out. And I just put kind of an example planning sheet that has been used a lot in genetic diseases and thinking about communication. And so, you can start with listing out your family members who you want to start talking about or talking with this about, and then going to what might they already know? Where are you starting from with these family members? Talking about when might you tell them? And when can be a day of the week, can be a time, it can be a part in your journey, but really thinking about that when. How will you tell them? Will it be in person? Will it be over the phone? Will it be email? What is the modality that you might use to share this information? When will you follow up? And we'll talk a little bit about this more as well, but I think we also need to kind of move the idea that communication around genetic risk is a one-time thing. It really truly is a process and requires check-ins from both providers and family members. And then any other things that we may need to think about in terms of family dynamics or other considerations around the communication. So many families have found it very helpful to actually start kind of planning this out before they have their conversations. So the last thing that I will point out before we start talking a little bit about the actual communication is this idea of learning styles. So each individual, all of us in this room, has a distinctive way or manner in which we are inclined to approach a learning situation or opportunity. And this can help us think through, again, that modality of how do we communicate this information in a way where the communication is actually successful. The information is absorbed, ingested, and understood. So of course, we have visual learners. In these cases, things like infographics can be really helpful in conveying information. We have auditory learners, so these may be individuals that prefer to learn through listening to a video, listening to a talk, listening to a podcast. We also have those who prefer to learn more through experience and observation. Maybe inviting family members to an appointment with you might be a way to approach this. Reading, writing, those who prefer to learn through the written word, textbooks, notes, etc. And then there are some who are what we call multimodal, which really kind of are flexible, and so any one of these may be an appropriate approach with those individuals. So I hopefully very quickly kind of set a framework of how to think about and plan for communication to family members. And so now we can move to some of the key aspects that are really important to communicate to your family. And in talking with Miranda, she gave me some great ideas of topics that can be difficult. And so I hope to cover a few things in terms of genetic testing importance, clinical trial participation, and of course, how the heck do you communicate around a variant of uncertain significance? It's obviously, I think very helpful as you're starting this conversation to start with some very basic disease information. I took this from a video from rarediseases.org. I really just kind of liked that this was very top level. At this point in time, it's not important to get into the nitty-gritty of the disease, but sharing basic things like there is a spectrum of disease. There's 4 different types. It's hard to tell what type a person will have. It is an X-linked disease. Here are some symptoms, here's how a diagnosis is made, and here's what treatment or management might look like. Very simple, very high level at this point. It's also really helpful because of really talking about potential next steps, to talk about the inheritance patterns. Again, visualization for this I think is really helpful for family members who don't spend a lot of time in the genetics or inheritance space. So just showing kind of the risk that might be happening throughout the family, who is at risk, depending on whether the XALD is coming from the father's side or the biological mother's side. So I think for many of us, as we're thinking about communicating to family members, our goal for many of us is to get them tested as well, so we can appreciate what their risk is as well. And so having just some quick talking points about why genetic testing is important can be really helpful. And it can be as easy as saying finding and managing and treating ALD early can lead to better health outcomes. And really that it's critical for the identification of individuals with ALD and our ability to actually start to use management and treatment options. But it's also helpful to identify those who aren't at risk. That is also very, very helpful information, and what would change kind of the paradigm of how we think about their disease management or lack of disease management going forward. So I just wanted to provide some kind of terminology that you might hear as well as we think about genetic testing in families. We call this process of testing family members in the genetics world cascade testing. And so this can just be helpful. You may see this or come across this in your Google, because I know you all will Google things, as you should. So cascade testing is the process of informing family members of a genetic condition, followed by that family member being tested for the condition. And this is a very hot topic in genetics as we want to make sure that any of our testing that we're doing is appropriately reaching other family members who may be at risk. So I know we've talked quite a bit about clinical trial participation as well, and I think it's been very nicely highlighted that choosing to participate in a clinical trial is a personal decision, and people are very motivated or afraid to join for very different reasons. So some motivators for clinical trial participation can be, of course, access to new treatments or promoting one's own health. There are some who really want to further science. They think it's important to improve our disease understanding. They want to contribute to our disease understanding for both themselves, but maybe for their family members, maybe for their nephews, their grandsons, etc. Some have very altruistic motivators. They want to help others, regardless of whether they're related or not. They want to help future patients. And another huge motivator for clinical trial participation, this has been shown in a lot of research, is just healthcare provider recommendation and discussion. This can really change who decides to participate in a clinical trial or not. In terms of fears and barriers, and I want to focus a bit on these because this is an area where I've heard a few conversations throughout this conference on, how can we maybe overcome some of these. So one of the biggest things we hear are logistics and time commitment, having to get multiple appointments, having to travel a long way. So are there ways that we can mitigate that in some ways? Concerns around privacy and confidentiality. The paradigm in the United States in particular around health privacy and concerns around confidentiality and autonomy of your health data has fundamentally changed since the COVID-19 pandemic. And we need to kind of reassess where we are in this country in terms of trust and motivation under those guidance. And so that is going to be something that we really have to think about. How do we better sell our ability to keep patient data private? How do we make people more comfortable with the idea of medical research? We are also, as humans, generally have concerns around uncertainty. And so clinical trials can be seen as an uncertain path forward. And so how can we kind of help provide some certainty and some information around the process to help people feel more comfortable around what to expect, both in terms of the process, but safety and just trying new treatments. And then, of course, I kind of mentioned this already, but there are definitely concerns, especially in certain populations, and absolutely rightfully so, around being part of research owing to historical misuses within this country. So I'm going to talk from there a little bit and shift to talking about your variants and variants of uncertain significance. For those who aren't aware, there are right now a kind of a 5-category classification of gene variants according to the American College of Medical Genetics that start with benign or likely benign, where we don't think that the gene or the variant is likely associated with the disease, to likely pathogenic on the other side, where we do think that the variant is associated with disease, and then this pesky situation in the middle called variants of uncertain significance, where we're just really not sure what's going on. So this is just a quick visual that shows kind of what that actually means in terms of clinical follow-up. So if we find variants that we consider to be benign or likely benign, in most cases we'll consider that individual kind of negative for the disease, and typically there's no further clinical action. Likely pathogenic and pathogenic, those will be taken into account for clinical judgment and management. And then the variants of uncertain significance will kind of leave us in this framework of trying to manage what's going on and trying to better understand the outcome. In general, what we think of in terms of how a variant becomes a variant of uncertain significance, we define it as a genetic change that's identified through genetic testing that lacks enough evidence for us to definitively classify it as either benign or pathogenic. This is very hard to explain to the public in the United States. We have very low genetic literacy in this country. Most of our genetic understanding comes from Grey's Anatomy and CSI, God help us all. And so there's a general perception that genetics is black and white. And this idea of doing genetic testing and not getting an answer is very, very confusing. And so we have to talk about why that is the case and how we can continue to learn more about variants of uncertain significance to put them into one category or another. I hope you've heard, certainly in the ALD space, if you have a VUS, you are not alone. If you have a VUS in general, you are not alone. Most of the variants that are in the kind of primary clinical database of variants are variants of uncertain significance. But a VUS may not always be a VUS, and this can be helpful to convey as well, that we can do things like other types of testing, looking at family members, maybe utilizing new technologies over time to better really classify those variants. And this can be why it's really important to do more genetic testing or to participate in clinical trials to help us better understand these underlying genetic etiologies. Okay, so let's say you have a plan to communicate to your family, you have determined what you want to say, you've said it, and now we can get a number of possible reactions from family members. Of course, some family members will respond very positively. They'll be grateful for the information, they'll take on next steps, and that's probably the smoothest path forward. We see a lot of family members who may not show any interest at all, or maybe not even know kind of how to respond. So they may say things like, "Oh, we don't need genetic testing. We go to our doctor all the time. It's fine." And so here are some suggestions for how you can kind of approach those. So, in those situations, it can be helpful just to say, "Great, glad you go to your doctor all the time. Next time you go, can you share this information with them?" We also have family members who really respond negatively or push back. And I think it's important for us to think about this. Most of us in this room are knowledge is power individuals, but there are equal numbers of people who are ignorance is bliss type of people. And there is a somewhat of a normative expectation, I think, in medicine that people just inherently want to know this information. They want to have this information, and that just simply isn't very true. So there are family members who will say, "I wish you had never told me this. I wish we had never had this conversation. I would love to go back 30 minutes and be happy again." That is okay. That is an okay response. It may not be the final response. I think many of us have felt that way when we've gotten bad or traumatic news. And so the best way really in those cases to approach this is just to acknowledge, yeah, this news sucks. This is upsetting news, and give time to process and maybe come back later and check in and let them know that you'll be there for support, or you have other support that they can talk to as well. So I'll end with kind of a summary of things that we've talked about that can be really helpful again in shaping this conversation moving forward. So defining your why and your own motivations for sharing this information with your family members. Kind of educating yourself, determining what information is important to share. And again, you don't have to throw the book at them. We can start slow and really just give them a framework to start having and processing this information. Come up with a plan. It's okay to come up with a plan. I love spreadsheets. Use spreadsheets. Identify who you want to tell, what they might already know, what modality will you use, in person, email, will you have a video to show them, infographics, and then choosing that appropriate time and place. Then actually go forward and share the information and provide some education about the disease, maybe your specific variant, next steps that you'd like to see. Try to address concerns, especially around privacy, and just be prepared for varied reactions. And then don't forget to follow up. Again, this is a process, so offer resources and check in as well. So with that, I will end, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So you touched on the issue of family dynamics, and quite often within families, unfortunately, there can be situations of estrangement.
Yeah.
Haven't talked to someone in a while based on any number of circumstances. Is there any guidance that you could recommend on broaching those conversations? Because it's one thing to be regularly in touch with someone and have this conversation. Might be something else to be giving them this blow when you haven't spoken for quite some time?
I think that is, yeah, that's a unfortunately common situation. So I think in those situations, that may be a really good place to start thinking about who else can help you, have this conversation and to realize that you don't have to be the only one. So is there someone in the family who is still in contact with that person? Is there a friend who's still in contact with that person? That you can leverage and kind of help have that conversation in kind of through someone. I think it depends in terms of whether or not you want to send a letter, whether or not you want to, send some other type of message will depend a bit on more information on the reason for the estrangement and kind of that situation. But in my experience, although I'd open it up to other genetic counselors in the room as well, but that trying to enlist others is really helpful in that situation, and can just take some of the burden off of the individual who's already burdened with their own situation.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I just thought of a question as I was sitting here, and I was thinking of another family that came to this conference and presented and sharing their story. So sometimes with newborn screening, as you go up the family tree, you find that there is a symptomatic adult that was misdiagnosed and possibly for decades have been tied to this diagnosis and don't want to let it go despite this new information. And I really love the motivator slide. So, I was looking at that and thinking, what have you found in your experience would be the best way to approach someone who doesn't want to accept the possibility that maybe there's a whole new disease, that they were wrong and there may be a whole new disease now that they have to learn about?
Oh, that is a tough question. I think, again, one of the best things to always start with is that acknowledgement. We operate so much around our identity, and we set up identities, whether that is a professional identity, a personal identity, a disease-specific identity, and those become very real, and we become tethered to our identities. And so I think acknowledging the fact that, hey, I understand you have had this disease for a long time, and you have been operating under the assumption that it's this. I think one thing that can help is to, remind people how much science changes and grows and how much we learn. This is going to become an increasingly common thing: cerebral palsy, epilepsy. I mean, we're going to start to see people who have had disease identities start to fragment as we learn more about the genetic underlying cause. So I think maybe talking about the idea of the fact that science evolves, and sometimes we've grouped things because by symptoms, but now we're grouping things by genetics, can be helpful. I mean, and it doesn't have to take away from that identity. It becomes kind of a supplemental identity. So maybe also framing it in a way where you're saying, I'm not taking away that. I'm shifting it a bit, or I'm adding to it a bit. But I think this is going to be a problem that I don't want to call it a problem, but it will be something we'll have to address a lot in the genetics community around individuals who have found themselves in different disease groups that will be fragmented as we learn the genetics. Thank you.